I have a complicated stance when it comes to Star Wars. The original movies from the 1970s and 80s were as good as it gets. I don't remember my father introducing me to those films, but I'm almost certain it was him who did. I loved those films. None of them are masterpieces per se, at least not in my mind, but they are brilliant movies nonetheless. Even the prequels are enjoyable, though I will say on average they are far from amazing or even good movies. I grew up with the Clone Wars TV show. It started slow but eventually picked up and told fascinating stories within the Clone Wars era that matured alongside the audience. However, since then Star Wars has received yet another trilogy of movies under new ownership with Disney now at the helm. It started half decent but became clear very quickly they were making up the plot as they went along, and in the end we wound up with the garbled nonsense that was the rubbish Rise of Skywalker.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Sorry, there was a typo in the script and I couldn't be bothered fixing it. It was a trilogy of films that turned my casual love for Star Wars into complete and utter exasperation. These days, I can tolerate Star Wars only in extremely moderated amounts, and I keep my expectations as low as they get. And that's a bit of a funny introduction considering the title, but bear with me, and all will become clear, I hope. The problem Star Wars suffers from now is a rampant sickness I like to call Disney. Since they've taken over, we've received 3 nonsensical films that devalue the sacred original trilogy in ways I simply could not have anticipated, with the writing quality of a Wattpad fanfiction and the gravitas of a wet fart. We also received a conclusion to the Clone Wars, which initially began before the Disney takeover but carried over into it, and it was actually decent because of course it was, but it almost never happened. We also got Star Wars Rebels, the animated TV show, which was alright. It had some excellent moments, but at times derailed itself by being episodic, but I won't criticise that too harshly as it was intended for children initially. And then there's countless other Disney Plus shows where Star Wars can indulge the infuriating trend of creating spin-offs of spin-offs to feed a bottom line. Something Disney seems consistently interested in doing, also going down that path with the MCU. We got The Mandalorian, a brilliant concept completely nullified by terrible pacing mixed with insignificant side quest style subplots that derail the actual progression of the narrative in literally every episode, diluting it to the point where I couldn't even tell you what the fuck that show was about. Not to mention the concept of a western themed bounty hunter series set in the Star Wars universe being sidelined instantaneously because look at the adorable little Force-sensitive goblin. The Book of Boba Fett is just The Mandalorian Season 2.5, both serving to devalue the mystique of Boba Fett, which made him so compelling in absence of actually being interesting in the original trilogy, and sidelining that character in his own show to show us little Grogu because of course it did. I also don't know how the Book of Boba Fett came about as a spin-off to The Mandalorian when the entire purpose of Mandalorians in the Star Wars universe is to contextualize Boba Fett's armor. The Obi-Wan Kenobi show is cool enough, but entirely comprised of overpowering fan service to distract us from the fact that the show makes absolutely zero fucking sense. It's enjoyable because it's Ewan McGregor returning as Obi-Wan, but it's blatantly detrimental to the source material in my opinion, and the Bad Batch is from a parallel universe where the Clone Wars has zero depth. Andor is, well, this guy's in it so it gets a pass, but besides that it's about as interesting as watching paint dry. Oh yeah, I forgot about Rogue One and Han Solo. I'd summarised them, but I guess that already has. And now we're getting another trilogy focusing on Daisy Ridley reprising her role as Rey Skywalker. I can't even say that with a straight face. No disrespect to Daisy Ridley, mind you. Star Wars has diluted itself to the point where it no longer fits the genre it initially specified itself to be. It's no longer the family-friendly space opera it once was. Under Disney, it's become a monopoly of the science fantasy niche. You've got space wizards in the movies, space wizards where they aren't welcome in The Mandalorian, which is also a space western, space espionage in Andor, space force child perspective in The Bad Batch, space heist thriller in Rogue One, space blatant whatever Han Solo was meant to be, space The Godfather in The Book of Boba Fett mixed with a space western which somehow brings it back to a mini space wizard who may be cute but surely to Christ isn't related to this plot, Jesus. Star Wars has become confused, disorienting and convoluted, and Disney expects you to consume all of it. It's becoming increasingly difficult for Star Wars to feel like Star Wars when the actual content we're getting from the franchise is arriving in greater volume than ever. So the last people you'd expect to be the heroes in this dumpster fire would be Electronic Arts. EA's Star Wars games are perhaps the least Disney that Star Wars gets these days. Battlefront's reboot and Battlefront 2 were a good time, simple but fun, however not without issues. That Starfighter game was okay, probably better if you like VR, but it's cool. Respawn Entertainment's Jedi Fallen Order was sick, and as a result, Star Wars Jedi Survivor may just be the only Star Wars related product I am genuinely interested in right now. And I'll say it outright, I'm actually excited for it. Everything I've seen so far has given me a positive impression, though I'll be honest, I'm not diving down the rabbit hole of watching every content creator on the platform's takes on it. It looks like a genuinely good game, a fantastic improvement over Jedi Fallen Order in many ways maybe, and I'm certain it won't be without its flaws as nothing is. Whilst it's nice you can give Cal Kestis a mullet and all that, that's not what has me excited. In today's video, we're going to be exploring the true reason why I'm willing to risk disappointment by anticipating Star Wars Jedi Survivor. And that, my friends, is its predecessor, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order begins from a position of strength. It uses the fact that it's set in an already established world to help tell its story to begin with before any words have been spoken. The plot begins 5 years after the events of Revenge of the Sith on the scrapyard planet Bracca. We see Old Republic vessels being broken down into small pieces, monitored by the Empire via a floating probe droid. The game doesn't need to yet overtly introduce us to the concept of Star Wars because Star Wars already exists and had existed for 42 years prior to the launch of this game. The scene is set through external context and a more organic establishment of the tone and themes. The game uses only subtle cues to apply that pre-existing world building. Why? Because unless this is your first Star Wars experience, you already know the vast majority of what's going on. So instead, we get to enjoy some Mongolian throat singing. I'm not complaining because Mongolian throat singing slaps. We're quickly introduced to our main protagonist, a scrapper, former Jedi Padawan in hiding named Cal Kestis, a man with delightful red hair, a decent personality, and a complex of utter self-loathing.
Depart this barge immediately. You are not approved trash.
And trash? Just not approved trash.
Cal's story begins working in salvage on Bracca. The game uses the first few minutes to traverse this bleak, depressing corner of the galaxy. Whilst Cal is familiar with the people around him, the game ensures we know this is the bottom of the food chain, somewhere completely dire and dirty. This is the lowest somebody can get in the Star Wars universe, the perfect hiding spot for a fugitive on the run. Quickly, the plot develops with Cal and his friend, a pleasant alien named Prauf, who sounds like a trucker.
Come on, Cal, you're a young guy. You don't end up like me.
Find themselves involved in an incident that forces Cal to use his Force abilities, exposing his identity as a Jedi in front of a lingering probe droid. The game doesn't even need to suggest what might happen next too heavily, as we already know. Cal, now alarmed by having to use the Force, decides it's time for him to grab his stuff and lay low. But before he can even get there, he has to take a train. Exhausted by reconnecting with the Force after so long, he takes a nap. In this nap, he has a vision where his former Jedi Master tells him to trust only in the Force. But then he wakes up to an Imperial inspection. However, the presence of some more intimidating looking troopers suggests that this is a little bit more than just a simple inspection. This is where we're introduced to the Inquisitors, the second sister and ninth sister. If you've seen Star Wars Rebels or the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, you'll know who the Inquisitors are. If you haven't, you won't. At the time though, Obi-Wan Kenobi wasn't out and the Inquisitors had only really made an appearance in the kids' TV show Rebels, though I'm sure they probably popped up in some comics somewhere as well, I'm not that clued up. Despite being a low-grade villain outfit for a side story within the universe, the Inquisitors fit here quite nicely. In fact, they make sense for Star Wars. Why wouldn't the Empire use some Force users to their advantage, and their loose implementation prior to this game gave them a threatening aura of uncertainty, which provides Cal an enemy that isn't a big bad from the original trilogy that we know he won't defeat. Okay, let me pause quickly. The implementation of the Inquisitors in Star Wars is for this exact purpose, to conveniently give characters enemies they can beat in stories that don't necessarily play into the main movies directly, if at all, when the main Star Wars plot is quite restrictive when it comes to what can be done in between the pages of the overarching story being told. It's why they were introduced in Rebels, so that there was an interesting foe to drive Kanan and Ezra forward as Jedi, and it's why they're in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, because we know Obi-Wan won't necessarily stop Vader, so an Inquisitor side plot is introduced to ensure there is some good that's been done come the end of the story, in absence of doing anything altering events on a massive scale. I'd say it's unnecessary in Kenobi as that plot is better served as an internal conflict, but it's alright in Rebels, though that show moves on to bigger and better things in Thrawn in its later seasons. But it works here for there to be a force-wielding antagonist at or around Cal's endgame skill level, something to be believably built up towards that convinces the audience he's developed mentally enough to overcome his fears and then consolidate that in a physical action to serve as a grand finale. Anyway, to continue, this is an example of external pre-context working in Jedi Fallen Order's favour, because they don't have to explain any of this, and it's also positive to see the Inquisitors utilised in a role that doesn't make them just a nuisance. Anyway, the Inquisitors kill Prauf, discover Cal, and he escapes. And that introduction went over a lot of in-lore detail without having to overexpose any of it. Wait, what's happened here? It's nice for a long-standing franchise to occasionally not spoon-feed the audience and treat the players like idiots. The story starts strong, simple like the original Star Wars film, but crammed with subtle cues that there's a broader story and the universe wasn't cooked up just for the tale being told. A lot of the new Star Wars stories under Disney try to do both, provide a shit ton of exposition and nothing at all, coexisting in the stories they tell whilst simultaneously not, and don't harness the lore of the universe at their disposal as well either. But we'll tackle that later. What this means for Jedi Fallen Order though is the introduction doesn't have to be slow paced to get into the action. Cal is forced to reveal himself after watching the second sister chef up Prowl. Cal is quickly overpowered but manages to initially escape, and we find ourselves now running along a train as the game introduces us to simple enemy archetypes and combat mechanics, with parkour already having been covered in the opening gameplay segment. Cal happens upon Somaid. I have no clue how they conveniently got here so quickly, and the explanation doesn't really work for me, but a ship appears and a woman tells Cal to keep moving. After another brief confrontation with the second sister in which Cal is again totally outmatched, they manage to escape aboard the ship. This is where we're introduced to two key characters, Ser Junda and Grease Dritus. Ser's goal is to rebuild the Jedi Order. If you have any Star Wars knowledge at all, you know immediately that this is not the endgame for Cal, as we know he doesn't eventually do this. But it works as a broad objective for this individual story that doesn't really connect with an awful lot of the rest of the universe, because it's sensible for a surviving Jedi to want to do this. Perhaps more so considering Cal was only a Jedi Padawan, and though he's aware of the risks from living several years in hiding, as a young man he's still going to be somewhat naive. The broad objective knowingly not being the story's ending immediately works in Jedi Fallen Order's favour, because it establishes to the audiences that this story isn't actually about restarting the Jedi Order, but rather to tell a story about characters, specifically the development of Cal Kestis from an unlikely survivor who is sort of just going with it because it's his only chance of survival in a galaxy that's hunting him and anybody like him, into a wiser and more connected, internally speaking, individual. And Cal isn't fully believing in that end goal at this point anyway. The game uses a modicum of exposition to explain that trust hasn't been earned by Ser or Cal, to each other just yet. However, they have what Sarah explains to be a common cause and a common enemy, and since Cal has nowhere else to go, this means he's got no choice really, so he investigates a temple on Bogano to start unravelling a mystery. Jedi Master Eno Cordova locked away a holocron on Bogano detailing potentially Force-sensitive children across the galaxy. In order to access this holocron, or at least Eno Cordova's knowledge, Cal must unravel the secrets of the ancient Zepho race. This is because Eno Cordova cannot entrust the holocron to just anybody, and he's also dead. The main focus of the plot, however, is not the future or anything like that, it's about Cal. He's a lost individual without hope in a big galaxy. His mission is spurred forward because he doesn't have a choice, but besides that, it's the fear and regret of the past. Regret for the fact that he couldn't save his master, and fear of facing his own perceived failings. The already established universe allows the plot to move along swiftly as Cal slowly comes to terms with his master's passing, the fall of the Republic, and more importantly the Jedi Order's collapse due to Order 66. We get to experience Cal's perspective during this time thanks to flashback sequences that also serve to unlock new abilities as the story progresses, culminating in the most traumatic moment of Cal's life. This structure gives us great insight into this character and the gravity of what he needs to overcome to truly become a Jedi, and once he does overcome it, he's far more powerful, far more connected to the Force, and therefore wise enough to know that the mere existence of a holocron documenting the existence of Force-sensitive children across the galaxy in itself is dangerous knowledge. So at the end, after a final confrontation with the game's main antagonist, the second sister, and a run-in with her true superior, Dark Lord of the Sith himself, Darth Vader, who for some reason looks a little bit Lego in this game. Cal decides the best course of action is not to find these children before the Empire does, but to ensure that neither he nor the Empire find them at all by destroying the very MacGuffin he's been chasing. It's a decent handling of a MacGuffin chase as well. Whilst irrelevant in Cal's actual mental development, the holocron doesn't necessarily lose its importance to the events unfolding, as despite this development occurring, it's still being chased. Instead, it just shifts in meaning altogether from the beginning of the plot, even if this isn't exactly specified to us until the very end of the story. I wouldn't say it was a perfect handling, but it certainly worked for its purpose. Moving on, the story occurs somewhat in isolation from the broader Star Wars universe, with the occasional appearance of a character from elsewhere, like the Wookiee Tarful, who made an appearance in Revenge of the Sith. He's a minor character from that movie, but his appearance here makes sense. Then you've got Saw Gerrera, a rebel extremist who appeared in Rogue One, The Clone Wars, and Rebels. He appears because it's kicking off on Kashyyyk, and he would naturally be where it's kicking off, because he's probably the one who kicked it off. And Darth Vader's brief appearance at the very end serves a broader purpose than just because. Vader is there to remind you that whilst compared to the ordinary man Cal is very powerful, in the grand scheme of Force users, he's insignificant. As is this story, and it makes it perhaps the more interesting of the Jedi Purge Survivor stories, because it takes this moment, and by extension the time, to put itself into perspective. And this is something, on the whole, that I can appreciate about Jedi Fallen Order. It uses the already established Star Wars universe to its advantage to only carefully implement minor fan service where it fits. This ensures the story doesn't stray too far from Star Wars, and in equal measure, it doesn't venture too close to the movies. Not providing that perspective isn't necessarily a big problem with Star Wars, however there is a big problem with Star Wars and overdoing fan service for the sake of it. It also seems many Jedi actually survived Order 66, and yet by the time of the original trilogy, they are all conveniently just not present. Another key aspect to how this game works well as a Star Wars story is its sheer simplicity. Cal is not a complex character. He's got a family-friendly aura, but he's a young man living with survivor's guilt. The story may be something of a MacGuffin chase, but that in itself is insignificant. Cal is after peace of mind. Development is the plot's primary purpose, and we see this character grow from a damaged child cowering in the shadows to a thoughtful Jedi Knight. The Knight's demeanour is rather consistent, but his understanding of what makes him a Jedi is this narrative's primary focus, because there's no world in which this would have been satisfying had this not been a focus. As we know, Cal doesn't restart the Jedi Order, so they need to add an extra layer, and that was Cal himself. With this character focus extending beyond Cal, the story does go a touch on the predictable side, especially with the second sister. a mysterious, masked antagonist with no name, and a chance encounter with a Jedi ally who's very loose on information about her past, and doesn't have a very good poker face.
Your Padawan. Did she survive? No.
The second sister's identity is revealed to be Ser Junda's Padawan learner, Trilla. Everybody saw that coming, and it plays into Ser's own development, as Ser's development works in tandem with Cal's. The two characters don't really trust nor distrust one another, they are strangers, and that bond doesn't really develop. There's no master or apprentice dynamic here, but rather mutual respect. Ser cut herself off from the Force after caving to the dark side, and her development is for the most part unknown until later in the story, but effectively she's a former Jedi turned ordinary who has to face her failings in the fall of her Padawan to the dark side of the Force. Her story is far less satisfying, but it functions because it isn't the primary focus. She's effectively on the same journey as Cal is, however at a different level. Cal was but a learner and Ser was at least a Jedi Knight. The common theme is accepting the past, evolving beyond fear of, in Cal's case, not being good enough, and as for Ser, the fear of falling to the dark side completely like her apprentice, and moving forwards rather than hiding forever. This also translates to the plot's main antagonist, Trilla, who has become overcome with fear and fallen fully to the dark side. But is she beyond saving? I suppose that depends whether or not this dickhead's in the room. Besides this, Ser is a likeable character who comes across as genuine, and despite her relevance to Cal's story being predictable, more or less from the moment she mentioned her Padawan, it certainly doesn't suffer for that. There are other characters who are just as interesting. Grease is the pilot of the Mantis, and the vessel through which any necessary explanation can be justified, as he's not really clued up on the Force, as he isn't himself Force sensitive. As a result, if anything needs added clarity, his presence can justify it, though the game doesn't do this often, and prefers to instead mostly allude to Star Wars lore in an organic way. Grease is like a likeable, grumpy stepfather.
You were talking in your sleep. Weirdo.
The other allied character is Night Sister Merrin, who is slow to trust Cal as he is a Jedi and to her the Jedi are the enemy. Cal only wins Merrin's alliance through proving his understanding of being a Jedi means keeping the peace over wielding a lightsaber, and then aids her in dealing with Taron Malachus, a Jedi turned dark side wielder who had manipulated the Knight brothers against each other before taking control and manipulating Merrin into believing the Jedi were in fact responsible for great atrocities, without going into too much detail. As an ally, she reveals herself to be quite an interesting character for the brief time she's present. Merrin often makes dry comments with a dark sense of humour, and she serves as more of an anti-hero, which slots nicely into the Mantis' small repertoire of characters. And then of course Cal's strongest relationship is with Eno Cordova's droid BD-1. BD-1 is basically Cal's closest ally, a small unit with tons of personality. It's basically a robot with chicken legs. Ah, Respawn, you're clever. The droid accompanies Cal everywhere from the moment they meet to the end of the game. BD-1 serves to provide gameplay convenience, alongside charming beeps and bloops that you come to expect from droids in Star Wars. No Star Wars story is complete without a droid character with personality that transcends spoken language, and BD-1 exemplifies this quite well. Then there are the holograms of Eno Cordova himself. Whilst he's not really interacting with Cal or any other character on account of his appearance being archived footage, he does serve as a character that effectively trickle feeds us information about the Zephyr in particular, and as a progress marker to tell Cal he's on the right path for the prize that he's seeking. Jedi Fallen Order keeps its cast of main characters small as to not convolute the character-driven story at its heart with too much going on. There are drop-in, drop-out characters, but the main cast is quite small, and this also translates to the story's main antagonists. We've already been over the second sister Trilla. However, there's also the ninth sister, a large, intimidating, bipedal rhinoceros. She's scary, but her character primarily consists of being a mid-game boss fight to hype us up and show Cal's increase in ability and confidence, as such traits are needed in order to defeat her. She also helps explain the process of becoming an Inquisitor with extreme torture at its heart that helps us understand Trilla's journey to becoming the second sister and Ser's reasons for cutting her connection to the Force. Does she have much character besides this? No, but she does have a terrifying physical presence, so that's good enough for your mid-game boss fight. Then there's Taron Malicos, who is used to give us an objective to earn an extra ally in Night Sister Merit. His impact on the plot chiefly consists of that, and that's fine. An extra lightsaber boss fight never hurt anybody in a story that revels in its lightsaber combat. His own endgame is never clarified, nor is it truly important to the narrative. Gaining Merrin's allegiance is all that matters. And then Darth Vader's implementation into the plot only really serves as a cameo, but it's also a reminder of the story's insignificance to the broader universe, which allows us to focus on Cal's character development more in retrospect, and the ending immediately after suddenly makes more sense as Cal understands he is far from powerful enough to protect a new generation of Jedi, and perhaps that's not his destiny either. To conclude this chapter, the overall story is quite a simple concept and it fits in line with the more traditional Star Wars stories. It's a battle of good versus evil, not necessarily in individuals but rather in the state of mind. It's hardly unique and it's detached enough to not interfere with events it could compromise due to the characters not being written when those stories were told. All in all, Jedi Fallen Order's weakest point is that it's a story about yet another Jedi, in fact 2 Jedi that survived Order 66. Seriously, how many more of those stories can be told before Disney and Lucasfilm realise they've completely diluted the impact of Episode 3's most pivotal world-building moment? Even then, I'd argue Jedi Fallen Order figures out how to counter this issue by throwing a Darth Vader encounter in at the very end, in which Cal's only hope is to run away, proving how useless he'd actually be on the grander scale, to ensure this story sensibly remains confined to its corner of the galaxy, so to speak. So to conclude this entire chapter, the story is decent. That's all that matters. For this chapter to make sense, it's going to take a touch of Star Wars bashing, so you're going to have to forgive me for that. You see, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order's strongest attribute when compared to other modern Star Wars stories comes from the fact that unlike the majority, including the sequel trilogy, the story is applied to the universe and not vice versa. And it plays back into its comprehension that it's in a pre-established universe that wasn't designed for it. You see, the original Star Wars film from 1977 that's been retitled A New Hope had to apply the world after creating the story. This is because it was the first and there was no Star Wars before it, so the world was crafted to suit the narrative, the main storyline that George Lucas wanted to tell. You could argue The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi were then added to that world, but to be fair, they were a part of that original story. So initially, the Star Wars universe was designed to tell the story of these 3 movies. As a result, there are certain things in those films that don't necessarily need contextualizing, and sometimes just because is a fair explanation. It's the creative liberty of crafting a new universe. A similar liberty could be taken for the prequel trilogy being set prior to the events of the originals, and whilst it needs to play into establishing the foundations of the originals, that's quite rear-ended. Going in though, it's a similar thing as we're experiencing this universe in a prior time period, so what happens at the start doesn't necessarily need too much explanation. A certain aspect of what's going on going into, say, The Phantom Menace can occur just because. The sequel trilogy's greatest mistake is assuming that they have that very same freedom. The Force Awakens being the key example. Set 3 decades after Return of the Jedi, it feels almost as if the characters just sort of like stopped and the Star Wars universe progressed. So when we come to the 7th movie, every character is seemingly equally as unaware of what's gone on in the decades since the end of Return of the Jedi and the beginning of Force Awakens as we are. This is consistent carrying over between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker 2, but back to The Force Awakens, there's too much going on that doesn't necessarily get explained by anybody to the point where it doesn't seem as if anybody really knows what's happened. For now, Han, who married literal royalty, is a smuggler again, just because. Han and Leia's son is now a heavy-breathing dark side user, just because. Luke is nowhere to be seen, just because. Leia has returned to running what is basically a rebellion, and somehow the Empire is back in the form of the First Order and is bigger, better, more powerful and stronger than ever. just because. Some of this might get explained in a slapdash fashion, sure, but there's too much of this that doesn't receive any context whatsoever. Everything's been set up exactly to mimic the original trilogy with a story that mirrors it, but on a grander scale. Instead of the Death Star blowing up Alderaan, you've got Starkiller Base blowing up half of the fucking galaxy. The problem is, these are sequels, so you need to explain these things, and the sequel trilogy really doesn't. Instead of building up to this or establishing sensible factors that make it possible, the universe is just applied in a state that fits into the story they wanted to tell. This doesn't just devalue its own story, the original trilogy, or even the prequels, but literally every Star Wars story ever told. Why? Because in short, it's an assassination of the fucking universe. And that's before you even factor in the complete meltdown of storytelling, because these movies are just a pissing contest between J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson. So it doesn't even translate all of its transgressions into a comprehensible story, which in my opinion makes these films even worse. It reworks the entire Star Wars universe at a whim, because if any of the characters from the original trilogy were actually present during the events that led up to these sequels, none of the events in the sequels would actually happen. My point being, you cannot rework 4 decades of world building in a pre-established fictional universe for plot convenience. If you have to do that, especially repeatedly, you're telling the wrong story. I know it's a skewed comparison, as Jedi Fallen Order has far less creative freedom as a side story to shake things up too drastically. And of course, if the sequel trilogy shook up the Star Wars universe in a way that we could actually see over the course of the films, it would be a different story. But the point is, Jedi Fallen Order doesn't start from a position of not making sense. It's a lot easier to settle into this story in the very opening than it is to settle in watching any moment of any of the sequel films. Look, Jedi Fallen Order and the sequel trilogy are incomparable in every way. One's a side story and one's a continuation of the main overarching Star Wars narrative. And Jedi Fallen Order makes sense, it's appropriate for the time period in which it's set, and it justifies itself being told. I cannot necessarily say any of that for the sequel trilogy. I think it's safe to say the sequel trilogy is also harmed by the absence of in-between stories set between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. Now you've got The Mandalorian and The Book of Boba Fett, but they can both barely coherently tell their own stories, let alone contextualize the universe. A lot of the newer Star Wars stories barely feel like Star Wars, because unlike in the past where the galaxy, whilst functioning as this wondrous elaborate backdrop, also existed to tell stories in a massively interwoven experience, now it feels almost as if the world is simply being thrown on top of stories that may or may not even suit it. They connect loosely, but on a significant scale, simply not at all, because we don't know how we've got from one event to the next. It's refreshing to have a story like Jedi Fallen Order that did address that by establishing a story that makes sense to be where it is and doesn't aggressively rock the boat for shits and giggles. As a result, instead of questioning how something factors, I can sit down, switch my brain off and enjoy the Space Wizard game. It shouldn't feel refreshing for a Star Wars story to not be completely remodeling the entire world building to suit it, but sadly that's what's going on with all the Disney Plus shows and movies being vomited out. Sadly, Star Wars has become incoherent, inconsistent, toneless, convoluted, and makes less and less sense as time goes on, and it's quite exhausting. In this respect, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order feels like the exact opposite. It's far more decisive in its own technique, and understands the universe already exists and the story draws from the broader canon to have to jaggedly explain as little as possible, providing a smooth story that also makes sense, though direct explanation is sometimes needed and done, but only so far as necessary, because the story actually covers the rest of the bases. On top of coherently slotting into the Star Wars universe, Jedi Fallen Order also has a natural flow, because though the story is somewhat isolated, the universe has its own narrative that's been told in the movies and TV shows, and for the average consumer of Star Wars content, this doesn't really need a commentary to reiterate key moments. It can't be wholly without, but it doesn't need to front load all the plot juices, so Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order simply does not do that. But that only works because the story puts itself in a position where it doesn't have to. It provides a simple tone that feels like it suits Star Wars. It gives us a simple story that uses the backdrop of over 4 decades of world building to drive us onwards, splitting off to add new things and fitting lore where required, but it stays true to the narrative at hand and doesn't cave to throwing out fan service for the sake of it. And when there is an opportunity for fan service, it doesn't assassinate the character in the process. Jedi Fallen Order works because it doesn't tread on the toes of pre-established lore simply because it doesn't line up with whatever wacky shit it might want to do. It compromises with what's possible, and the end experience is something that feels far more authentic and clean. I don't understand why Disney are so content with the vast majority of stories not taking their time to simply allow things to flow naturally either. The Force Awakens frankly wasn't terrible for this issue, however by the time of the Rise of Skywalker at the end of that dreadful trilogy, it certainly was. Jumping from bit to bit because A, there was no outline going in, and so the story had a lot of gaps to fill anyway because somebody decided to make every last plot point from The Last Jedi a buggered commentary on old people, women, men, capitalism, and animal cruelty, whilst killing off the trilogy's main antagonist with no immediate follow-up, and B, everything needs explaining in as much detail as possible, which it somehow manages to both do really unnaturally and also doesn't explain the important parts and summarises it to somehow Palpatine fucking returned. What I mean is, it's not like Star Wars front-loaded a galaxy of information on us outside a unique title reel back in 1977. It gave us some information but allowed a well-paced 3-act story to be told and gave us all the information we needed naturally rather than rapidly. Then as the movies went on, this was expanded gradually to give us a well-organised and thought-out universe to shit away with the poor delivery of the prequels, but the world building held fast as a result of this cautious approach, even still. In newer Star Wars stories, the world building only exists if it lines up with the intended storytelling, and it doesn't work in that order as well as it does in Jedi Fallen Order, where the story is comprised of an understanding that the world building is already built and only needs supplementing with particular additions unique to what's in front of us, which can be added far more naturally and progressively. To summarise, the first Star Wars needed to have a world that aided the story and a story that aided the world, as did its initial sequels, but this far down the line with the gigantic world already built, it's no longer necessary and in fact detrimental to throw the characters into unbelievable positions for the sake of plot convenience, and should instead try to craft a story within the confines of the state of the world that's already built and progress from that. This is why Jedi Fallen Order didn't even have to be that good to stand out. It just needed to follow a relaxed flow that doesn't try to overload us with information and then refuse to provide context before adding unnecessary details to things that don't actually matter. Jedi Fallen Order didn't have to rework the situations the characters were in to fit the disorganised mess, and it sure didn't need to make big events occur in between the lines because it's not crammed with meaningless nonsense. The sequel movies made a habit of doing this, and in the end it opened plot points it never closed and closed plot points it never opened, which was nauseating. Jedi Fallen Order not only completely comprehends but also appreciates that the world it's set in was not made with it specifically in mind. It was made for a grander tale, and this is but a side story under the gigantic umbrella. As a result, less context is needed to get going, and the story can follow a simple step-by-step plotline far easier and doesn't need to rock the boat to be satisfying. Therefore, this is a story that inhabits the world it's in and uses that world to its advantage, whereas the sequel trilogy, for example, tries to have the world inhabit the story when it doesn't even remotely fit and the story itself is warped beyond making sense. The bulk of my appreciation for Jedi Fallen Order stems from the fact that it simply doesn't try to break molds that would depreciate the very fabric of the setting itself. Everything from there is just extra. Before we continue, I'd like to address the skewed comparison myself before the comments do. Yes, movies and games are different mediums for storytelling and come packing different limitations and significance, and that is prevalent here. However, my point isn't about what is a game versus what is a movie. My point is about the core story being told and how that's handled from the perspective of writing, and how Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order succeeds, not necessarily where the sequel trilogy fails, because they aren't even remotely the same thing outside being set in the same universe, but rather what qualities Jedi Fallen Order uses that the sequels simply needed to apply to. From that perspective, I feel as if my take is somewhat sound, but knowing me, this video is probably already an incoherent mess of alphabet pasta, so let's move on. Star Wars has usually been quite good when it comes to developing and presenting interesting, flawed characters. Off the top of my head, I can think of many examples. Darth Vader / Anakin Skywalker springs to mind as the easiest example. Ahsoka Tano is another. There's some decent charm in Luke Skywalker and Han Solo, especially if we disregard the sequels, but we can't really do that. We can't have this both ways. However, their development prior to this still stands. I also quite liked Obi-Wan Kenobi as an interesting character, though perhaps his charm stems primarily from well-landed portrayal over writing quality, but you could say the same for many others. And that's only to name the fewest names possible, or we'd be here all year, and Cal Kestis is no exception to this rule. Cal was a character raised in the Jedi Order until the fateful Jedi Purge saw his master killed before his very eyes, by clones he thought were his friends, leaving him physically and mentally scarred for life. Cal's journey in Jedi Fallen Order is him overcoming this trauma. He explains he feels his connection with the Force is somehow damaged, and the plot shows him come to accept the past and finally understand the true meaning of what a Jedi is. This emboldens him. We see his confidence increase and his angst disappear. We see him struggle to begin with and develop into a well-collected and controlled character. Cal's journey is a struggle for him, and we feel that. What's at stake will never affect the main Star Wars story, but for him the stakes are huge. He cannot hide anymore. He must accept the past and move forward if he has any hope of survival. The plot gives Cal a reason to move forward and places adequate obstacles in his path, trials he must overcome and truths he must face. He's not a perfect character, but he has a rhythm. He can be sincere and serious, and he can also be more light-hearted and personable. His sense of humour is quite light and allows us to humanise him, but beneath it all, he's still just a lost young Padawan. This humanisation cements you in the story more so than all-powerful personality perfect do-gooders like Rey can in the sequels. Rey has no real Achilles heel, she's just all-powerful and morally perfect. That doesn't represent anything. She is just good at everything and has no real flaws besides from the non-point of her origins that don't stay consistent film to film and don't actually hold her back at any point to make overcoming such an obstacle, even if only a mental one, worthwhile. It's crucial, especially for a main protagonist, to have flaws. If there's no real struggle in a story, there's no true middle act in the 3-act format, and that's typically where the going is thickest, not that it's a hard and fast rule. It's just something I've observed. To me, this is especially crucial when discussing a chiefly character-driven narrative. And any Star Wars story is about characters above all else. Cal is flawed in his struggle to truly come to terms with his master's death, and that takes a toll on him over the course of the first 2/3 of the narrative primarily, I'd like to say. He only overcomes that towards the end of the story, and as a result, his growing abilities, crafting of a new lightsaber, achievement of the rank of Jedi Knight, even if technically unofficial in absence of an official channel, his triumph over the Second Sister as well, and his decision to destroy Cordova's holocron rather than seek out the Force-sensitive children is an amply satisfying payoff to come out of the back end of struggles that stem from Cal's past. Another flaw of Cal's is hardly a flaw, but I'll mention it anyway. He's far from overpowered. He defeats his primary foe, but when he comes up against Vader, he's desperately outplayed. It puts Cal's grander importance into perspective, but also makes us realise it doesn't really matter. The burning question of how this will factor into the broader universe and fit flush no longer needs answering, because we know Cal as a character is going in a different direction and will need to take a slightly different path that reasonably draws him away from compromising, say, the original trilogy or anything ridiculous like that. And all of this character is great in writing, but it's nothing without a performance to deliver it. and Cameron Monaghan performs Cal exceptionally in my opinion. Now, I'm no acting expert, I'm pretty shit at it, and I've only ever done a voice cameo for an Assassin's Creed podcast series, and I sucked fundamental eggs, so I wouldn't delve into that because whilst I can argue I'm neither qualified to critique writing nor acting, I can at least write things down in broken English, so there's that. Let's move on. Now, not only is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order a good Star Wars story floating in a sea of garbage, it's also not a bad game either. It isn't really the point I want to hit home in this video, but I'd feel bad for not at the very least addressing it. The game has some climbing and platforming, however it revels primarily in its lightsaber content. Since the Revenge of the Sith tie-in game from almost 2 decades ago, I've enjoyed a good lightsaber combat oriented gameplay experience on occasion. Massacring the Jedi Temple in that game was an absolute blast, and that's no different in Jedi Fallen Order, though minus the Temple Massacre. In this game, you massacre stormtroopers, droids, animals, bounty hunters with really weird names, and face other Force users in boss fights. These fights feel weighty, challenging, and require a decent amount of concentration, of which I typically lack. Once you've got your head around slashing people up with a weaponized glow stick, you have some light customization, puzzles, parkour as I mentioned before, and semi-open areas to explore, and find secrets that aid the limited customization of your lightsaber, droid, ship, or clothing. All in all, it's a decent game. It's a bit on the buggiest side at times, but frankly, it's a pretty concise experience that doesn't go over the top. There are skill points and a skill tree, but it's rather small and limited, and the main skills also unlock as you progress naturally through the story. It's good that a game can have those features without having to micromanage your skills absolutely all the time, so the gameplay gets a thumbs up from me. This video is however about how Jedi Fallen Order is better than the crap being churned out left, right and centre these days, and not about how it holds up as a video game, so forgive me if this chapter was brief, and almost feels like a ploy to drive up watch time, my apologies. Let's quickly shift onwards. With Jedi Survivor, as of recording this video, now truly only around the corner, I think we need to dedicate a cooldown portion of this video to looking forwards. Jedi Fallen Order was far from a perfect game, and there are also certain things I'd like to talk about from Jedi Survivor that has me excited to play that, but chiefly we'll be discussing how Jedi Survivor can improve on Fallen Order and stuff like that. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is set around 5 years after the events of Jedi Fallen Order, in which time the crew of the Mantis seems to have split off, and yet Cal is still in possession of Grease's blessed vessel. He's been functioning as a thorn in the side of the Empire all this time, and it's likely in these 5 years he has evolved as a character and matured further. He even has facial hair now. Very nice. His trim is also far less mental, though I'm aware we can fix that by giving Cal a mullet. Very nice. Can we make Cal bald though? That's a very big question. Obviously the story and world building are huge drawing factors for me. I presume this story will further detach Cal from the prospect of being involved somehow in events that he just wasn't involved with. A theme of trying to survive is likely over any grand plot to stick it to the Empire, and I'm sure that'll be fitting. That brings us to our first key point. Jedi Fallen Order did its utmost to stay primarily detached from the rest of Star Wars, exploring new planets like Bogano and Zepho with stints of pre-existing worlds such as Kashyyyk, Ilum and Dathomir. This more outward approach worked for it, exploring regions that weren't necessarily too involved in stories from the time, but going forward with that handle, Jedi Survivor could benefit from doing the exact opposite almost, with more central galactic locations such as Coruscant making an appearance. Hopefully this is handled well. The contrast in world building is sure to be fascinating. Hopefully Jedi Survivor adapts properly to suit this, as things are sure to be more complex and lived in more built up areas. This is another thing Jedi Fallen Order didn't necessarily need to do. You see, Jedi Fallen Order was good at using the world building of the overarching Star Wars universe to settle you in this story, but when it came to providing atmosphere of its own, it didn't really need to do as much world interaction as a result. Everything present was all that was necessary to tell a story, and with that now done, a follow-up story can expand a bit and have Cal interact with a world space more laterally. So it's still present for story purposes, but also to allow us to soak in atmosphere, or at least a differing atmosphere to Jedi Fallen Order's consistent themes, and yet hopefully remain consistent to the story being told at this time. I feel I didn't explain that properly, so I'll add to it and I think it'll make sense. The Stinger Mantis in Jedi Fallen Order functions as a small hub area. You have limited space and characters and interactions were fairly limited, with unique dialogue only really occurring in brief flights between worlds. Otherwise, the ship was firmly landed and all you could do is spot your boggling companion, customize your lightsaber, choose which world to go to next and meditate. Jedi Survivor appears to be going about this in a different way, with what's effectively a hub area on a world, with a planet serving as something of a base of operations with exploration within itself. It won't necessarily be a safe area all in all, but at least it's a region where the plot won't necessarily progress and we can explore in peace and visit if we need downtime between missions. Supposedly there will be a town here full of NPCs. This is something Jedi Fallen Order also didn't do, so it'll be good fun to soak in the atmosphere of what will serve as a downtime area. Apparently we'll be able to buy resources and upgrade equipment, and I can only pray they haven't overdone this, because systems like this can go one of two ways: really well or really poorly, so fingers crossed. Additions like that can add an extra layer and dynamic to a story as it progresses, and I'm sure Jedi Survivor will carry on from Jedi Fallen Order in one way or another, especially considering it's the same protagonist. Supposedly, at least, some of the planets will be larger and more open world spaces, which is ideal. Jedi Fallen Order tended to cling to more windy maps with long corridors and narrow sections with a set path from A to B, and it was confusing on the map being multi-layered with no map HUD and portions of that turned back on themselves. Having to manually navigate these areas, which was the only option, wasn't the worst thing ever, and there's a market for a game that makes you venture the long way, but when the plot has you doubling back on yourself a little bit, it did start to wear off the magic of these explorable areas. If the Jedi Survivor world spaces, at least in some areas, were more expansive, and as I've discovered, there is a fast travel feature to simplify returning to the ship or to an area you've already visited, it'll make for a smoother experience and provide more areas to explore and secrets to discover, but again, I can only hope this isn't an incredibly dramatic difference, as overdoing open world spaces can also lead to much more shallow world building. Not that most games have a long-term fictional universe of that laying around as is, so maybe that'll help. The main thing is the world building persists and we get a vibrant lived-in experience that fits Cal at this stage in his story. This of course will mean the introduction of new characters as well, and we know there are a few of those. Notably, Nasir Dalal, who played Charles Smith in Red Dead Redemption 2, joins the cast. New dynamics and the evolution of old dynamics are an exciting prospect. Jedi Fallen Order didn't suffer for its small circle of main characters, if anything it just gave the plot focus. I'm assuming Jedi Survivor is the middle part of perhaps a 3-game trilogy, meaning it will be able to expand on the characters from the first part and also introduce new ones, as that's a lot less legwork than developing just new characters completely from scratch. Away from the story, because I'm poorly qualified to talk about that further, let's discuss the gameplay aspect of Jedi Survivor, because nothing feels better than mutilating unsuspecting conscripted soldiers who are just doing their job and unbeknownst to them are led by an evil tyrant and his heavy-breathing apprentice. First positive, mutilation. Lightsabers are established as early as the first film as weapons that can easily slice off a limb, yet Disney for the longest time has shied away from showing that in their products. That was a mistake, as it devalues the impact of these massively dangerous swords that took mastery to wield effectively. Lightsabers are cool. If you gave me a glow stick and told me it could cut through anything in its path, I'm in. Battle droids. Yes. More expansive lightsaber combats with a greater variety of enemy archetypes to face and different strategies to defeat them. Fantastic. We get to keep our skills learned in Jedi Fallen Order. Excellent. I presume this means we'll be learning entirely new abilities, which is what you want really. Deeper customization is always a good bonus. My only real hope is this game doesn't fall into a pit of bigger equals better just because it is bigger. And whilst Jedi Survivor no doubt will be a larger game and all that, have you seen the file size? Fuck me. Hopefully it shall also be an improvement where it counts beyond surface area and story length, but only time will tell. Fingers crossed it stays true to Jedi Fallen Order and tells a mostly isolated story regardless of its backdrop that doesn't play necessarily too deeply into any broader Star Wars narrative unless it really makes sense. This is the only upcoming Star Wars product that I even care remotely about. So please, Respawn, don't shit the bed. To bring this video to a conclusion, it's been a ramble. We've explored Jedi Fallen Order's juicy bits, how it really suits Star Wars and does so far better than other Star Wars stories in recent years, for the most part without effort. It's a compact story of characters, not events, that fits into the universe it's made for. It's a narrative of internal struggles that get embodied by physical actions just bold enough to feel satisfying. Jedi Survivor has a massive advantage that's becoming increasingly rare in Star Wars, especially these days. It's building on a story that had integrity and impact. Provided it doesn't shit itself, it's got a really good chance of holding up. That's all that really matters. I don't care if it isn't the best narrative ever, or even the best game ever, because it's Star Wars. It'll never be that. But it can at the very least be a fun, exciting and satisfying experience all in one. And if that is accomplished, job's a good one. That brings us nicely to the end of today's incoherent ramble. For those of you who have sat through my word soup all day to the end, I thank you. And thank everybody for watching, of course. I hope that you've all enjoyed this video. Be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff. That would be super fantastic and of course massively appreciated. And if you like history, maybe check out our history channel Decades. It's pretty neat if I do say so myself, but if that's not your thing, don't worry, there's plenty of content to come here. And if you don't like me at all, fair enough I wouldn't either. Anyway, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care and goodbye.